Tonight's program will be moderated by my colleague, our Council's own Program Director, Ronan O'Malley. And now, let me go ahead and introduce our speaker. Our speaker today is Andrea Kendall-Taylor, who from 2015 to 2018 was Deputy National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia at the National Intelligence Council. In this role, she led the U.S. intelligence community's strategic analysis on Russia, represented the intelligence community in interagency policy meetings, provided analysis to the National Security Council, and briefed the Director of National Intelligence and other senior staff of the White House. Prior to joining the NIC, Andrea was the senior analyst at Central Intelligence Agency and many, many other accomplishments in the past. Currently, Andrea is a senior fellow and director of the Transatlantic Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. She works on national security, challenges facing the United States, Europe, focusing on Russia, as I mentioned, threats to democracy, and the state of the Transatlantic Alliance. She's also is an adjunct professor at the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. Andrea and Ronan, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
Great. Thank you, Sonia, for the great introduction. And Andrea, thank you so much for joining us again. Last time was in Houston. This time is virtually, but hopefully next time we'll host you again in Houston. And thank you again for your service, your many years of service as an intelligence officer. I think a lot of times the work that you all do and the dedication you all do is, I think, sometimes overlooked, and sometimes because you have to have a lower profile. But thank you for all that you've done, and I know you continue to do on the outside, still organizing and so advising and directing different levels of the intelligence community. Just to start for today's conversation, we'll get into other items, but maybe start with two of the bigger headlines of recent weeks with regards to Russia. The big buildup near Ukraine, and also what's happened with Navalny. Maybe I'll just start with Ukraine. In March and April, Russia amassed about estimated 100,000 troops, including tanks, artillery pieces, short-range ballistic missile systems, on the eastern borders of Ukraine and also in Crimea. It also increased its Black Sea fleet in the area to think about 45 vessels. It was the largest military force Putin has put near the area since it annexed Crimea in 2014. Obviously created a lot of concern for the West, in particular those in Ukraine, if maybe they're going to invade eastern Ukraine and take Donetsk or other parts of the country. 2 weeks ago, as fast as it built up, it was kind of wound back down. There's been a withdrawal, a partial withdrawal. There's still a large number of troops still there. But overall, it's a bit of a kind of looking into somebody's magic 8-ball. But why do you think Putin did this? I mean, what were the intentions of it? Who were maybe the most intended audience? Was this largely to send a message to Ukraine and let them know for sure who is their most dominant force they need to reckon with? Or was it a show of force to the West? Was it for a domestic audience back home? How do you see, I suppose, why he did it and why, what it means for the region?
All right. Thanks, Ronan. And I'm going to say, I think it was all of the above, kind of ticking through your different factors. This was the most significant Russian buildup since the illegal annexation of Crimea. And I think, unfortunately, it's really difficult to know exactly what was motivating Putin. The troop buildup was extremely overt. It was out in the open. So it was pretty clear that it was a signal that was intended to be observed by the West. And I think, not knowing exactly the ranking of these factors and the way that they played in Putin's mind, but I think now there's kind of some consensus around three broad groups of explanations for why Putin may have done, why he chose to escalate this way and when he did. And the first kind of set of reasons has to do with the Russia-Ukraine relationship itself. I mean, this is in many ways a bilateral issue. And recently in Ukraine with Zelensky, there has been a bit of an anti-Russian bent to Ukrainian policy. We saw Zelensky going after Russian oligarchs, Medvedchuk, for example, putting sanctions on him, some crackdown on Russian media outlets also in Ukraine. And so I think there was a sense, from the Kremlin that they wanted to demonstrate to Ukraine that they weren't willing to tolerate any real change in the status quo of their relationship. And of course, Moscow has been frustrated for some time with the lack of progress over the Minsk agreements, which is supposed to, be a political pathway to resolving the conflict in Ukraine. The Kremlin's frustrated by the lack of progress. Very recently, Zelensky had said before the military buildup that he wasn't willing to meet in Minsk, in large part because of Lukashenko's very violent crackdown on protesters there. So I think there's a lot of this was very much about Russia-Ukraine dynamics and the Kremlin kind of signaling that they're not willing to accept any change in that relationship, and also to pressure Ukrainians to make some real progress on the Minsk agreements. Then I think the second bucket of issues, it's not totally untied to the incoming Biden administration. I guess the linkage there is concerns in Moscow that with the incoming Biden administration could embolden Zelensky to take this more anti-Russian stance. That was something that we saw with the Georgia crisis in 2008. And the Kremlin had saw that play out, that Saakashvili at the time believed that the United States was behind him and it emboldened him. And so again, with the incoming Biden administration, I think there was some concern in Moscow that Zelensky could feel emboldened, that he would have the support of the Biden administration and also kind of the European allies in his corner. And then the other piece I think that's about signaling to the Biden administration is about kind of Putin's desire not to be an afterthought. And early on in this administration, the Biden administration, I think they've been pretty clear that China is the number one foreign policy priority. There's almost been a laser-like focus on China. And from Putin's perspective, he doesn't want to be an afterthought. And so by doing this, it kind of compels the United States to have to take Russia seriously. And it's almost Putin saying that, he too has a say in where Russia will be in US foreign policy priorities. And then the final piece, I think, that has to do with the Biden administration is, President Biden has come in promising to restore alliances and to rally a democratic coalition to push back on authoritarian powers. It's really notable that the military buildup on Ukraine's border happened at the same time as we saw an uptick in military activity by the Chinese Communist Party around Taiwan. And I see that in large part as these authoritarian powers being fairly concerned about President Biden's ability to catalyze this democratic opposition to their regimes. And so part of it, again, is to signal discontent. It's provoking a more aggressive response. And then I think the final factor, the group of explanations for what motivated this could be domestic. At home, you mentioned Navalny. Navalny's in jail, was suffering from extremely poor health. I believe he had just started his hunger strike and he was, deteriorating health conditions. The Putin regime, they have a Rada election, a parliamentary election coming up in the fall, and they have some fairly stagnant domestic support at the moment. And so what we've seen coming from the Kremlin is very much a besieged Russia mentality. I mean, this is something that we see Russia regularly turn to kind of drum up domestic support. Again, notable that with the Putin is a killer comment, the Kremlin immediately called back their ambassador. I think in large part because Putin wants to show his domestic population that these external enemies are real, that the external players aren't taking Russia seriously, and that he is a great leader and he is willing to stand up to the West. So that besieged mentality narrative in Russia has really been turned up. And and that was the narrative that was playing out in the case of Ukraine also. The Kremlin went to great lengths to portray this as provocations by the Ukrainians. And so again, Russia's not going to stand for that. And so he mobilizes troops to demonstrate his strength. And I guess, finally is to say that those troops haven't been withdrawn entirely. I think, there's been reports in the New York Times and some other places that still around 80,000 troops still remain near the border. They've left behind a lot of equipment, presumably, or they claim because they have their Vostok exercise that's coming up in the fall. But again, I think that this, from the Kremlin, this is almost like a Kremlin reset. They're trying to shape expectations with the Biden administration about what Russia's military presence and posture is going to be in the region. And I think now, because those systems and that presence is still left behind, it makes it very easy for Putin to ratchet up again should he need to ahead of the elections in the fall. So again, it's always hard to know exactly what Putin is thinking, but I think it's some combination of those types of factors that all kind of converged and led him to take those very provocative steps. Ronan, you're on mute.
Thank you. And thank you again. Like you're mentioning for Navalny, obviously people remember last year he was poisoned with a nerve agent, Novichok. Was lucky probably to get out of the country and get to Germany and in a coma, and recovered after many weeks in hospital. Got back to Russia. Was actually arrested because he was not officially reporting to I suppose the government when he was in Germany, even though he was in Germany in a coma, which is kind of ironic. But again, like you mentioned, he went on a hunger strike because his medical conditions weren't being met. He was having back pain and loss of sensitivity in his legs and his arms, maybe related to the nerve agent. So again, he was on hunger strike for over 3 weeks. Probably, we don't know exactly, might have been close to death again. In the kind of two things related to Navalny, I guess one, can you talk about the fact that even though the Russians eventually kind of backed down and let him get medical care, on the flip side of that, what was happening to his organization across Russia at the same time in terms of really cracking down on it and any form of opposition in many other ways? And then more broadly, outside of St. Petersburg and Moscow or the big cities, how popular is Navalny or any form of opposition for kind of the general population? And what do you see as the outlook for the opposition, especially, if Navalny was to be poisoned again or, sadly, fall off of a balcony, which happens sometimes.
Yeah. Okay. So I think, well, from the Kremlin's perspective, and I mean, this is a really awful thing to say, but if you're going to take the Kremlin's view, it was a terrible mistake on their part that they weren't able to kill him the first time with the poison, because now it's precipitated this huge crisis. I mean, and we have seen the GRU and Russian intelligence services kind of mishandle now multiple different events, from the Montenegro attempted coup crisis to the Skripal incident. And so now this has created a focal point for opposition inside Russia and has become really a thorn in Putin's side. It's pretty notable, though, that you asked about Navalny's popularity. He really remains, not extremely popular inside Russia. And even after all of this, I think public approval or kind of trust in Navalny still remains around 5 to 10%, somewhere around there. So it's not like he is, a significant threat to the Kremlin. And I think, what we've seen is the Kremlin then overreacting to Navalny. And I think it's a sign of the paranoia of the Putin regime and of Putin himself, which is something that you see quite often in these highly personalized authoritarian regimes who have been in power for 20 years. I mean, he now has kind of very limited access to information. It's put through filters through the security services who's prone and predisposed to these worst case kind of scenarios. And so I think the treatment and the handling of the situation, I think, signals a regime that's extremely out of touch with what's actually happening and exposes the real paranoia. From this point now, kind of thinking forward about where this all goes, as you mentioned, they've gone after now Navalny's organization, claimed anyone now who is also seen doing business with any of his organizations can now be thrown in jail. And so they have really shown that they have no willingness to tolerate any kind of dissent. And it is yet a further step in the deterioration of domestic conditions inside Russia. The repression is really ramping up in a really significant way. This pattern started when Putin came back to power in 2012. But I think, in the last year or so, it has really taken on a life of its own in terms of the way that they're shutting down domestic space. And so unfortunately, though, this is always the million-dollar question with authoritarian regimes who rely now on repression to maintain their support, right? Some people will call it a brittle system, But I think when you look at the data, especially on other highly personalized authoritarian regimes, I think the unfortunate reality is that repression can work for a very long time. And when you look at other highly personalized authoritarian regimes that have been in power this long, in almost all of those systems, you see repression rising towards the longer a leader is in power, the more they have to rely on repression, even towards the end of their tenures. Because I think, especially as we see in Russia, he doesn't really have a lot of other alternatives, other key pillars to sustain and prop up his regime. The economy is not doing well. Growth is stagnant. COVID hurt. The economic recovery is, going to be difficult. Also, the kind of euphoria over the illegal annexation of Crimea. We saw that huge bump in public support for Putin in 2014. That euphoria has kind of faded away. And at this point, then repression is really all of this that this regime has. But again, I think the unfortunate reality is that repression can often work. Because the Navalny himself hasn't managed to gain significant traction, and now they've kind of eliminated his organization, I think the opposition has really a very steep uphill battle to confront Putin. One of the things that I'll be watching is the elections in the fall. But I think that with what they're doing, they've shown again that they're not willing to tolerate any real dissent. They're not taking any chances with the elections this fall. And that's, I think, then the reality is that we are facing a much more repressive authoritarian regime in Moscow.
And at the end, I want to turn to a kind of a broader discussion of what the U.S. and the West can do to kind of maybe push back against this rise of autocracy, not just in Russia, but other places. But just to turn to maybe kind of a last thing people might have seen in the headlines the last few weeks. Last year, the Duma approved and passed a referendum to change the constitution to allow Putin to potentially be in power until 2036, which if he was, he would be in power longer than Stalin, which is kind of hard to imagine. And then he signed it into law, I believe, in April. I suppose, what do you see as the realistic chances that he is in power until then? There's no obvious successor in place. Perhaps that's on purpose. It's forecasting. But oftentimes people in power for more than 10, 15 years, the transition is not a smooth or peaceful one. What do you foresee maybe the next 10, 15 years of Putin in power?
So I'm really glad you asked about this, because it's such an important question, is actually something that I'm working on right now. And again, kind of bringing this comparative lens, what we've been doing with a colleague of mine, Erica France at University of Michigan, who also studies authoritarian politics, is looking at other highly personalized authoritarian leaders who have been in power 20 years and longer, and to see if there are any kind of patterned ways that these transitions tend to happen. And there's some fascinating stuff. We looked at, once a leader has made it to 20 years in office, I mean, that's a different kind of authoritarian system. There's lots of authoritarian leaders where you have more turnover, more volatility. But once you've made it to 20 years, you've kind of established an equilibrium where everyone kind of understands the unspoken rules of the road. People understand their roles, the red lines, they can watch them shift, but it becomes kind of a system that's really very much in equilibrium. And we found then once a leader makes it to 20 years, the average is that they make it actually to 36 years. So once you've kind of crossed that threshold to 20, then it becomes a durable and again, like a self-fulfilling kind of thing. And then 36 becomes the average tenure. We also looked at what happens when leaders remove term limits. And there's been 12 cases in the post-Cold War era. And once a leader removes term limits, they then tend to stay on for 10 more years and most often die in office. We looked at the patterns of leadership exit, and it tends to be when you have a longtime leader like Putin, who's older, 65 or older, that in 50% of cases, the leader actually ends up dying in office. And I think for kind of all of these reasons, to me, it suggests I think that's where the Putin system is, that it is a system in equilibrium. He doesn't face any real threats from his rule. I will say, though, that the second most common form of leadership exit is protest, around 17%. And to me, that seems, we are seeing some signs of discontent. We talked about the kind of dissatisfaction with economic conditions in particular as being an issue that's top of mind for most Russians. But I think it also, the really interesting thing too is what happens once these longtime leaders exit. And what we find too there is it's something about 80% of cases, the regime remains intact or you get a new authoritarian system. And in only about 20% of cases do you get any real liberalization. And again, you think about the conditions that Putin has created. He's basically eviscerated institutions. There's no real rule of law. He's sidelined some competent individuals and replaced them with loyalists in many cases, not in all domains, but in many. And so the conditions just really aren't right for any real significant improvement in democracy or human rights in Russia after he leaves. And so from a policymaker's perspective, I think it's important that highlights that we have, it's not a Putin problem that we have, it's a Russia problem. And that many of the kind of key contours of Russian foreign policy are very likely to persist beyond Putin. It's very likely that either this system or another authoritarian one takes its place. And so this isn't something, we can't just sit back and think we're going to wait Putin out, because very likely this all kind of continues past his tenure.
And maybe people might have just heard you use the term personalism. I think a lot of people obviously familiar with populism and a populist leader, and there can be some overlap between the methods of ruling and how they come to power between someone who develops populism and also personalism. But could you maybe explain to the audience how you define personalism in terms of political power, and maybe what it means in terms of how they concentrate power, how it's not just refined or I suppose attached to traditional autocratic states when I think of Putin in Russia or Erdogan in Turkey, but we might see it in places that has a longer history of democracy, like Bolsonaro, Brazil, or Duterte in the Philippines. Could you maybe talk a bit more about personalism in particular?
Yeah, so we, again, kind of some colleagues have done a lot of work on this concept of personalism. And we had, originally started studying this concept in the context of authoritarian regimes. And there are different types of authoritarian regimes. A personalist system is one where a single individual kind of predominates, and it's a very small ruling clique around that person where those people are often there by personal ties to the leader. It contrasts with a single party regime, which would have been like the PRI in Mexico or even the Chinese Communist Party, although Xi Jinping himself too is personalizing that political system. Personalism different than a military regime where you have a junta that has a say in decisions. So the personalism in an authoritarian setting is kind of where a leader really dominates the political system. And in authoritarian regimes, there's a great body of research that shows that has real consequences for the way that they rule. Their policies are much more volatile because decisions are at the whim of an individual. They're the most likely to invest in their nuclear weapons. They're the most likely to rely on corruption to sustain their rule. And they're the most likely to engage in aggressive foreign policy and be involved in wars with democracies. So these incentive structures, the way that they're structured, matters for the outcomes that they produce. Personalist regimes are now the most common form of authoritarianism. You mentioned Putin, Erdogan. You can kind of go down the list as that we can think of those leaders. But the really interesting thing, and where we've gone with some of our work, is to show that personalism is no longer confined to authoritarian systems. And what you are seeing, even in some established democracies, you named, with Bolsonaro in Brazil, Orban in Hungary, the Kaczynskis in Poland, thinking of, even you had Ivanishvili in Georgia. I would even argue Zelensky in Ukraine, where these leaders become kind of much more important relative to their political parties. And it's happening predominantly in Europe. But what we find is when leaders personalize the political system, it's very negative, has really negative implications for democracy. And even doing some complex statistical modeling, it's an early warning sign. When leaders personalize, the risk of democratic decline goes up very significantly, often because these leaders have created their own political party. And so they don't have a party who can push back on their efforts to slowly, gradually grab more and more power. So there's a number of reasons why it happens, but the rise of personalism is something that we're seeing even in established democracies, and it portends poorly for the kind of health and resilience of democracy.
And lastly, just on that issue, obviously you were in the CIA and the broader U.S. intelligence community for a long time. When Putin came to power, I think New Year's Eve, 1999, relatively unknown to most everyone in the West. Kind of the last few years, I suppose, maybe come up with Yeltsin, and maybe his agreement to leave Yeltsin be after he got in power was the most important thing. Bush said, "I could see into his soul." Obama tried to do a reset, even sending at the time Secretary of State Hillary Clinton with a reset button. Do you think that, a question I'm sure you get all the time, that it was Putin that changed? Maybe that there were some reason to be optimistic. He brought stability. He brought some degree of order to Russia that was not there in the kind of Wild West 90s under Yeltsin. Or that we're maybe seeing the real Putin now? Or is it just that if anyone's in power for 10, 15, 20 years of a massive country, an autocratic system, that maybe you get a bit paranoid, that it's going to change how you see the world? What do you see as kind of the real Putin?
Yeah, the question is it Putin, or is it something about the system? How important is the leader versus kind of institutions and structure? In terms of Putin, I think it's a combination of both things, right? It's almost like nature versus nurture, and then the reality is that it's somewhere in the middle. Clearly Putin's worldviews were shaped in large part by his experience in the intelligence services. He holds a deeply negative view of the United States and the West. So he came to power with certain kind of entrenched worldviews and understanding of kind of Russia's place in the world and where it needed to go. So I think there is, don't want to underestimate the fact that Putin's personality mattered. But I also think he lucked out in many cases. So he came to power in 1999 at the beginning of 2000. The price of oil goes way up. So he benefited from oil prices that were high. He also benefited from the kind of containment of insurgency in Chechnya and other parts in Russia. So he had a series of factors that I think made him genuinely popular with Russians and created an environment that was then conducive for him to try to restore and concentrate some power inside Russia. And that's where I think you do get into a case where the appetite grows with the eating. And as he's able to go after and tame some of the oligarchs, as he's able to kind of push some critical media outlets out of power, this dynamic of personalism is such that once you kind of go down this slippery slope, once you've kind of demonstrated to people in the inner circle or who could constrain your power that you can exclude them from that winning group, once that has been established, people then have to really think about whether or not they want to challenge these power grabs, because then they'll be excluded from the perks of office. And so it becomes kind of a slippery slope where he was able to personalize the political system. And now I would say, so he basically was able to personalize just the way that we were talking about. And in that case, then we see many of the trends that you would see and observe in other highly personalized political systems in terms of kind of the way he governs, what are his incentives and his constraints. I think it's a mix, obviously, of the ideas that he came to power with. He benefited from some conducive conditions that enabled him to consolidate power. And then then the appetite grew with the eating, and now he has kind of created this entrenched political system where everyone is, understands their role and their loyalty to Putin and are, I would say, unlikely to buck the system, because when you have that system, the inner elite then understand that if there are elite infighting or if people try to challenge Putin from the inside, then any kind of opposition from within the elite then risks the whole system. Right. And then everyone then no longer would benefit from their privileged perks and access to power. And so in that sense, the incentive structure of the elite is such that they want to maintain the system. People are bought into it and invested in and are unlikely to rock the boat at this point.
And you touched upon some of it earlier on. We're only 3 or 4 months into his presidency. But how would you define the way Biden is approaching Russia? You noted, obviously the return to alliances, which he sees as core. I think a lot of the military and the intelligence community see the same thing. How do you see Biden approaching Russia, and so far, I suppose, what do you think the outcomes have been?
Yeah, I mean, I think they've been really kind of clear about laying out the approach, which is we will confront Russia where we have to, and we are willing to engage where we can. And so, in the earliest days, President Biden came out and issued, well, first of all, he extended New START, the arms control treaty with Russia, which he only had a short window to do because the Trump administration wasn't able to successfully extend it. So he came out and showed right out of the gates that he was willing to engage and work with Russia when it is in the U.S. interest to do so. But at the same time, he issued the tasking to the intelligence community for their assessments of Russian interference in the 2020 election, Navalny, the SolarWinds cyber attack on the United States, and also the alleged Russian bounties on U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan. So he quickly put the intelligence community to work to understand what it is that we knew about each of those episodes. And then that led to what we saw, a week or two ago, which is the significant announcement about a response package, a series of sanctions that the administration announced in order to hold Russia accountable for those actions. So we saw a new executive order that the administration created that will help now serve as a deterrent to future Russian actions. This new executive order basically expands the tools and the capabilities that the administration has to hold Russia accountable. They sanctioned a number of individuals and organizations involved in the SolarWinds cyber breach, as well as the election interference entities related with Prigozhin, who were responsible for these influence operations inside the United States. So there was an attempt, in a way, they framed it as disrupting some of these unwanted actions that we see. So there was a disruption piece, a deterrent piece with the new executive order. And then they went after Russian sovereign debt, and granted it was in the secondary market. So we are only sanctioning, not prohibiting it sell in the secondary market and not the primary market. But that was a step up from what we've seen in the past. And I think it was an attempt by this administration to demonstrate their credibility, that they are willing to go there. They're willing to take some more stronger actions while still reserving headroom to do a whole lot more, right? People will maybe criticize that they didn't do enough, but you have to also remember that all of these actions that they were responding to happened under the previous administration's watch. And so this was kind of taking care of unfinished business with the hope that now that they can move to a more proactive agenda. And so, I mean, I get that really in a nutshell is they're gonna stand up and increase the cost to the Kremlin where they can. They're going to engage where they're able to. And so, of course, it's notable that President Biden is talking about a summit with Putin in June, where they can kick off an arms control and strategic stability dialogue. I don't talk about climate, maybe talk about Afghanistan, talk about trying to get Iran back into the JCPOA. So there is an agenda where there is potential for some engagement. And then the final thing I'll say is what I think their approach is this administration also recognizes how hard, I would say almost if not impossible, it would be to change Putin's calculus, right? So he's been in power for 20 years. He has firmly held views of the United States and what we're doing. And he's unlikely to change course, I think, in any real significant way. This administration wants to raise the cost for the behavior while also recognizing that fact. And so President Biden has also then very much doubled down on resilience measures. So he's talking about how can we restore our own democracy? How can we make our own democracy more resilient, focusing on election infrastructure, our cybersecurity, all of those things. If we can't change Russia's calculus, we can at least attempt to mitigate the effects of it. And then the final piece, of course, is allies and partners, where he's very, serious about working in conjunction in greater coordination with Europe to confront the Kremlin, knowing that that's really the only way, just like China, the only real way to apply pressure on Putin that he'll take note of is if it's in coordination with allies and partners. And I would say, where we've seen, I think, Putin take the greatest note of U.S. response would be in situations. So, for example, when they tried to poison Skripal in the UK, the United States and multiple European countries expelled Russian intelligence officers. And I think that it was so cohesive and coordinated was something that actually got Putin's attention. And so that kind of trying to build that cohesion and coordination with Europe is another key pillar. So it's those things: stand up, engage, increase our own resilience, and we got to do it with allies.
And you touched upon a lot of it, but maybe just in case there are any other aspects you'd want to add to it. We've talked about the U.S.'s approach and with our allies, obviously, but maybe in kind of broader terms with regards to the West, with regards to kind of traditional democracies. As you noted, even in Europe with Orban in Hungary or Zelensky in Ukraine, not in a long tradition of strong democracy there, but sadly even in Poland, there are reasons to have concern. These may not be your typical autocratic, despotic regimes, but maybe they're a quasi or kind of partial democracy where increasingly the election itself might be fair and open. The exact number of ballots counted and cast is correct, but everything that happens before the election and after the election is not. What is there that you think the U.S. and more broadly the West and kind of democracies in the West, whether it be Japan and South Korea or others, could or should be doing to try and push back and make people realize democracy is not a given. This is history doesn't end; it doesn't stop.
So that's a huge question, but obviously something that's at the top of the Biden administration's thinking. I mean, you can see, in Secretary Blinken when he's given some of his foreign policy statements, when President Biden gave his address to Congress, this idea of reviving and revitalizing democracy is kind of the thing that he is so focused on, and he phrases it about a competition between democracy and authoritarianism. He is very attuned to the fact that authoritarian regimes are trying to portray democracies as ineffective. And so he talks about, the only way that we're going to win this competition is if we can have our own successful models of democracy. When democracies deliver for people, when it works, then only then can we really mount a meaningful response to what countries like China and Russia are doing. And so, so some of the things, on technology, how do we build the coalitions that we need to set the rules and the standards and the norms about to ensure that technology is used in ways that uphold democratic values and norms. The administration, I think, is working very hard to actually increase coordination between European allies and our Indo-Pacific allies to try to build this more meaningful coalition so that Russia and China see that democracies can't be divided. So, I think a lot of his kind of theory of the case about how he is going to take on China and Russia is very much about ensuring that democracies deliver for people. And there's a number of things. I focus on the transatlantic space, and obviously getting allies on board to confront China is really important. And so there's a lot of debate and discussion about how can we more effectively get Europe to implement investment screening? How can we more effectively and cohesively implement export controls against, for these technologies that authoritarian regimes are using to repress their own people? All of these things, there's values very much kind of is front and center in a lot of these approaches and efforts to work with allies. But I think it's very much about getting our own house in order, getting the allies on board, increasing the coordination and cohesion, and then finding, the China challenge in particular is comprehensive, right? It's economic, it's technological, it's kind of there's an ideological bent to it. So kind of building these inclusive coalitions is really key to, I think, the way that they see this contest, as they've framed it, a contest between democracies and authoritarian systems.
And lastly, just people are submitting questions. I just before we turn over to the audience questions, you had a long career in American intelligence, highest levels, in the CIA and also the NIC, the National Intelligence Council. You hear a lot of people say in the last few years they've never seen the intelligence community be denigrated by their own president, whether it be the FBI or the CIA or others, or Trump. Sadly, was it 3 years ago in Helsinki in an interview, televised interview, he said he believed Putin over the CIA itself. I know some people are concerned about morale within the community. I mean, if you want to talk about that, that'd be one thing. I think perhaps maybe people are professional and they'll do the job anyway, no matter what. But are you maybe more concerned in a bigger picture that if a large number or large amount of the American population starts to no longer believe or think there's validity or think there's, kind of professionalism in the intelligence community, that say 5-10 years from now, we have an American president, whether it's a Democrat or Republican, and some major piece of intelligence says we need to do action X, whether it be a military operation or some massive economic sanctions, that a large part of the American public will no longer believe that, no longer has confidence in our intelligence community. What does that mean? What's the potential damage of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that during the Trump administration, I do think that there was really tremendous damage to the intelligence community and the morale. It did suffer. I know the community that I know best is the Russia community, and that was obviously really at the sharp tip of the spear, I think, with the criticism coming from the Trump administration. And so it bit, I think, like that people, the morale, I think it's fair to say, was hurt by what was happening in the relationship and the criticism that was coming from the White House of our own intelligence community. So I think that the new leadership coming in with Bill Burns at CIA and Avril Haines at the DNI, they understand that, they know that, and I think they're going to be working really hard to try to reestablish morale within these agencies. I think, there's been a lot of early statements from the president and others about their confidence in the intelligence community. So I think, in terms of morale, I think you can see that kind of snap back relatively quickly. I guess your bigger point, though, I think, about public confidence in the intelligence community, and I would also put on the table the intelligence community's ability to draw top talent. Is really important. And I'm not sure that bounces back as quickly. And I think that's going to take longer to kind of revive the public's confidence in the intelligence community. I mean, the intelligence community is apolitical. I mean, people really do genuinely check their political affiliations at the door when they come in. Aren't discussions about politics ever during work. And so, so very much like you said, people were willing to put their head down and do the job no matter what. There was almost a perception, and you could hear this. I was there till 2018, so I was there still under the Trump administration, that the intelligence community was going to, even if the White House wasn't listening, if we were gonna get it wrong, it wasn't going to be because of the intelligence community got something wrong. So there is a mission, there's a desire that, if there's going to be a weak link, if something's going to happen, it's not going to be on our watch. It's not going to be because we did something wrong or missed something. There was very much an idea like that we will produce intelligence for the record. I mean, there is a record of intelligence and where the community is on certain issues. And so that was very much kind of a mission-oriented and motivating factor within the intelligence community, despite some disinterest from the White House. So, I mean, I think people can have confidence that even under difficult situations, the intelligence community is so mission-oriented that they will keep their heads down and do their job. But your broader point about public confidence in the intelligence community, and again, that point about, I mean, the intelligence community is really only as good as the people in it. The intelligence community has to draw and attract top talent. And if that's not the case, then the intelligence suffers. So those things I think are a bit more concerning, but I mean, obviously that's top of mind for new leadership, and they will be working to kind of try to restore and renew that. And I know it would be very interesting to hear kind of what Americans' attitudes are about the intelligence community. I have never seen a poll or anything like that to understand kind of the extent of the damage, but it is really important that the community remains seen as apolitical and serving any administration, no matter who's in charge. So,
great, thank you. And just to turn to the audience, Andrew asked, does China prefer a strong Russia to distract the U.S., or do they prefer a weakened Russia so that it can focus one-on-one on the U.S.?
So I've done quite a lot of work on actually the Russia-China relationship. And that is a bilateral relationship that is deepening in, I would say, concerning ways. So we looked at the bilateral relationship between Russia and China in almost every dimension of the relationship. whether it's economic, diplomatic, in the technology realm, in the defense realm. Their ties are growing in a very significant way. And I do think it's the case for China that they see Russia as a very useful partner in being able to distract the United States, so that China can continue or draw less ire from the United States. So I think in key regions, again, it was notable that the escalation in both of their backyards in Crimea and in Taiwan was happening in and around the same time. I don't think it was coordinated intentionally, but I do think policymakers in thinking about China can no longer discount the Russia piece. But so one of the key findings when we looked across these dimensions of the Russia-China partnership, I think our key argument is that as they are working together, they are basically amplifying the challenge that they both pose, so that the Russia-China relationship is actually about more than the sum of its parts. And I'll give you an example. So in the defense realm, Russia is selling to China increasingly sophisticated weapon systems. They're selling the S-400. They're selling increasingly advanced technologies that are helping China enhance its anti-ship capabilities, its submarine capabilities, numerous things that Beijing needs basically to keep the United States out of Taiwan and out of its backyard. You can think about in the democracy and human rights realm, the two countries are basically singing from the same sheet of music. They're both working to kind of prop up dictators. They're looking to water down norms on the internet, water down norms and standards around human rights. In all of these ways, their interests are extremely aligned. They're both looking to undermine and decrease U.S. global power. They both believe in a multipolar world and want to accelerate U.S. decline. They are both kind of view democracy as a threat to their own hold on power. And so they're intent on rolling back democracy and undermining democracy. So it kind of in all of these different domains, Russia and China working together is amplifying the challenge of both. And I think it's most problematic when we looked at it in the way that Russia is actually amplifying the China challenge. And so again, just to go to answer the question, from Beijing's perspective, I think having a strong Russia is in their interest. And it is a useful tool in distracting the United States, but also because they are working, even when it's not explicitly coordinated, they're working towards many of the same goals and objectives. And so they find that as to be, a very useful partner in their efforts to confront the United States.
All right. And I might just combine these two questions, so they're somewhat related between Navalny and succession for Putin. Bill asked, what do you think motivated Navalny to return? Did he not anticipate getting arrested? Was he looking to be martyred? And I suppose related to that, on the backside of it, Julio asks, is there evidence of succession planning for leadership and or a favorite trusted advisor with regards to the future, course in Russia?
So on the Navalny question, Navalny knew, I think 100% what would happen if he returned, that he would be put in jail. And I think it's just, what a remarkably brave individual who obviously believes so thoroughly kind of in what he's doing, and that the sorry for the sun, I'm going to see if I can move a little bit.
Same issues.
Who believes, that the direction that Putin is taking Russia is not a Russia that works for everyday Russians. And, he has been so big on his anti-corruption campaign. He's built very much he has built this grassroots organization in order to try to create political options inside Russia and push for a more kind of democratic Russia. So, I think again, yes, I don't think that he was looking to be martyred, but he just kind of so deeply believes in what he's working for and is such a brave individual that's kind of what motivated it. And, unfortunately, he is in jail. I think he's likely to stay there for a very long time. As we talked about, the Putin regime, the way that they're turning up repression, they went after his organization and they're dismantling kind of the network that he has built all across Russia. And I think the consequence of that is going to be that you will have an opposition then that kind of feels a bit demoralized and kind of lost about where to go next. there isn't really another major opposition figure like Navalny. The opposition in many ways is divided because the Putin regime explicitly seeks to divide the opposition. I mean, really, in any authoritarian regime, what a regime wants to avoid is a unified opposition. And so they're constantly using tactics to try to keep the opposition divided. And so it's, again, even though Putin faces a really difficult domestic political system in terms of economic stagnation, kind of lower public approval ratings than he has had. His public approval ratings have dipped down. There is discontent about high levels of corruption. Unfortunately, there are no alternatives to Putin, and that's because that's the system that he's created. And I think and this kind of then gets to the second question. There is no alternative to Putin at this point, and that's the system that he has deliberately created. And I think that's probably the most important factor that keeps his regime in power. And so, no, there is not any succession planning. As you said, Ronan, he has removed kind of term limits or changed the constitution that would allow him to stay to 2036. We don't necessarily know what he will do. He could opt for something more like the Kazakhstan model, where President Nazarbayev, who had also been there since the collapse of the Soviet Union, stepped into a kind of strengthened role on a national security council. And although you have a new leader there, it's still Nazarbayev that pulls the strings of power from behind the scenes. So I don't think we know exactly what the transition will look like. But in all likelihood, again, kind of going back to that data, if I were putting money on it, I would guess that Putin is likely to be the one pulling the strings until he dies in office, because it's really just too risky, I think, to appoint a successor. And again, this is not unique to Russia. In most countries that look like Russia, their successors aren't chosen in large part because it can elicit backlash from the elite who aren't satisfied with that choice. You also then empower someone else who can eventually go after you and all of your corrupt holdings and your illegal behavior. So it can be risky in these systems to appoint a successor before you leave. It's not that it doesn't happen, but it can be risky. And at this point, Putin has not signaled anyone. And I guess my best guess of who would succeed Putin would be almost like another Putin, who is a figure who is relatively unknown until right before it happens. Oftentimes what you see in these systems is they'll find a consensus candidate who's someone who people maybe assume is relatively weak, who's not necessarily beholden to any one faction within the elite. They all kind of see in that person what they want to see in that person. They think that they can control and manipulate that person. So, I mean, thinking about that's what happened in Turkmenistan when you had the leader Nazarbayev die there. You got Berdy Mukhadmirov, who was the dentist in Uzbekistan. So oftentimes what you get is then a consensus candidate who everyone thinks that they can control, but then goes on to kind of consolidate power. So there is no real succession planning that anyone can see. And I would say, including from my time when I was in the intelligence community, it's still just kind of like the $1 million question about how we know he's going to die at some point, right? He can't stay forever, but no one has a good idea about what that's likely to look like.
And if his calendar photos are any indication, he looks like he's in pretty good shape, at least to go fishing.
He's only 68, right? Yeah. So I mean, yeah.
Barefoot, bare chested fishing or whatever, or scuba diving or whatnot. Walter asked a good question, I think, to close out on. Walter asked, with your view of changes in other democracies, what would be the warning signs we should look out for that might put our democracy at risk?
I feel much more confident about our democracy than I did a couple of years ago. And that's in large part because of, with the insurrection and kind of 4 years of Trump, we kind of have seen it and we've bounced back and we've lived to see another day and are moving on in a way where we can continue to kind of strengthen the resilience of our own democracy. But there has been some really fantastic research that looks at how democracies are breaking down today. And it's always useful, I think, to give that comparative framework. So basically, I mean, the key takeaways are that today democracies are breaking down far differently than they have historically. So when you look back democracies used to break down quickly, suddenly, decisively. Oftentimes they were coups. That was the most common way that democracies died. And now today, in the post-Cold War era, it's increasingly where you have elected officials, leaders who come to power in relatively free and fair elections and then slowly dismantle constraints on their power. And it's the playbook that you can see across all of these regimes. It was used by Putin. It was used by Chavez in Venezuela. It was used by Erdogan. It's Orban in Hungary. It's Bolsonaro. It's Duterte in the Philippines. These are all leaders who came to power in relatively free and fair elections. They go after the legislature. So they force judges to retire. They'll make some arbitrary new age limit, or they'll find other ways to force judges out. That's really the key that's happening right now in Poland, for example, is really going after checks and balances and the autonomy of the judiciary. Once you can kind of control the judiciary, you basically have a weapon to wield the rule of law, to basically use the rule of law as a weapon, right? So you can use judges to pass new legislation, create new laws that then, help you go after your own opponents. So it's step one is going after the judiciary. Step two is going after the media, oftentimes forcing critical media outlets out of power, either going with them using economic tools, tax police or other things. And then ensuring that those media outlets are then owned by people who are friends of the show, and then able to kind of tweak the editorial line of those institutions. You go after civil society, shutting down, again, watchdog organizations that can shine light on abuses of power. We've seen in many countries, often that's done under the guise of terrorism or other, these no foreign funding for these types of organizations, using anti-terrorism or instability as justification to shut down a lot of these outlets. And then really the last thing that happens is once you can control the judiciary, the media, a lot of these NGOs, then leaders can change the rules of the game, either, usually through gerrymandering, but change elections such that it becomes very difficult then ever to vote the party of power out. And so that has very much been the playbook. And so some of those warning signs were present in the United States, some less so. But again, I think we've shown the resilience of our institutions. I would have been really worried if it had been 4 more years of the Trump administration about what that would have meant for the health of our democracy. But again, I think we went through a pretty challenging time for our own democracy and are trying to come through it. Maybe the very last point, and I know we're at time, that I want to make though, is the risk of polarization. And there's also some really fantastic academic research, political science research, that talks about how rising polarization creates conditions that are more conducive to democratic decline. And so there's neat cases from Venezuela and all different places where Venezuela was a well-established democracy, a 2-party system that became increasingly polarized. And it's a story of how democracy can decline even when people support very strongly democracy. So it's citizens can still support democracy, but when polarization grows, people become willing to tolerate small abuses of power if it means keeping the other party out. And then elites understand that. They understand that their constituents aren't necessarily going to hold them to account because, if it keeps the other party out, we're okay with it. And you can get this slow degradation of democracy. So I think for me now, I think that's the thing that I am most concerned about, is this polarization and what that means for future parties and leaders who might be willing to bend rules to keep the other side out.
Well, that was excellent. And again, we'll definitely have to have you back to Houston. And for our audience at home, remind you, please join us next week on May 11th when we host Brad Stone, senior editor for Bloomberg News, for his new book and discussion of Amazon Unbound, Jeff Bezos and his global empire. And the week after that, on May 20th, hopefully you all can join us for our conversation with Chelsea Clinton with regards to global health initiatives and global health priorities. Andrea, Kendall-Taylor, thank you so much for your time and for your work and your service to the country. I think, like I've said at various of our webinars, I think a lot of people recognize and realize the service of people, men and women in our military, but a lot of times they forget about the years of service and dedication of everyone in our intelligence community. So thank you very much. Delighted to host you, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Ronan. Thanks, everyone, for joining.
Thank you.